Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name is Adam Oberhausen. I'm the Vice President of Customer Solutions with Right Brain Networks, and I'm your host for today. Joining me today is software and data consultant Tom Kowalski. Say hi, Tom.
Howdy.
It is also my honor to introduce Lancelot Carlson of House Heel Pay, the first of his name, co-founder of Payment Realms, Lord of Ruby Development, Warden of Artificial Intelligence, Sovereign of Entrepreneurial Ventures, and Ambassador to the Great Lakes Tech Leaders. Thanks for joining us, Lance.
Nice.
That was amazing, Adam. Thank you. Was that all you, or was that...
Oh, come on. I don't have a creative thought in my head.
I'm just not wasn't put in the time to put that prompt in, just for me.
And also, congrats on your growing family, Lance. It's I know it's a ways out, but got some additional twins on the way to make your family grow to 5 children here. Gonna be amazing.
Thank you. Yeah,
Nice.
I'm looking forward to it, but it's also this kind of storm that's brewing as far as my sleep goes.
So in this episode, we're going to be discussing the birth of the Agile Manifesto. And I'm going to be doing a series on Agile, and I want to start with like the beginning, right? And I think it's really interesting history. I think a lot of people probably know the gist of the history, but I think we're going to go back even further to like the 30s and 40s and kind of explore how software development, evolved over those decades, and then what led to the Agile the summit in 2001, and then kind of reflect on the 20 years since the Agile Manifesto was posted and kind of share our thoughts on it. So, and for future topics, I want to cover things like the Agile planning game, Agile programming, Agile teams, and how Agile goes wrong. But again, today we're going to focus on the origin story. I'm going to be talking at you guys quite a little bit here as I share the research I did for the show, but feel free to interrupt. I'm not an expert. Like if you ask me some details on what I'm about to share, I don't know if I'll have the answer, but we can always look it up. The source material for this episode is my personal hero, Robert Martin, Uncle Bob. So that he was one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto. There are 17 authors, so he's certainly not doesn't take credit for it, but he's one of the 17 that were there. And so here we go. So let's start by picturing ourselves in an era where computing is at its infancy. So you think of Alan Turing and a handful of colleagues are the only programmers in the world, right? So what methodology do we think they must have followed, right? I mean, it was probably something like very rudimentary. But they write the code, they compile the code, they test the code, they debug the code, and they repeat until it's correct, right? Pretty standard. But pretty quickly after, that initial group of programmers were doing their thing, the growth of programmers started to balloon, and all sorts of initiatives got kicked off. So it was pretty, early on, they needed a structured development process. And as with all projects, like you need an emphasis on completing software projects within the constraints of time and budget, right? Everyone wants to know how long it's going to take to deliver your software. So what's important to know at the time is there was already some recognized processes due to the Industrial Revolution that had taken place in the 40 years prior, right?
I feel like a lot of it, right, comes from either engineering or science, right? Borrowing the techniques, from the previous, right, industries.
Mm-hmm.
Agile, has a lot of roots from Toyota, right?
Yeah. So the individual that we should highlight here is a gentleman by the name of Frederick Winslow Taylor. For the 4 decades prior to computers being real, Taylor did these detailed studies on worker efficiency and transformed industrial production. He was one of the first people that became a major consulting firm that focused on efficiency, one of the first ever management consultancies in the country. So his principles heavily influenced a lot of the business processes and pretty much had global ramifications. So by the 1950s, the Taylor doctrine of systematic processes had pretty much permeated all of corporate landscape. However, going back to the 1930s, there was a different set of concepts that began taking shape. Those concepts were defined mostly by Walter Shewhart at Bell Labs. He devised a methodology called Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's very distinct from Taylorism. It was designed to be iterative and incremental, and these concepts were honed and popularized by Edward Deming as statistical process control. And Deming actually expanded the reach of these ideas when he assisted post-war Japan in rebuilding their economy in the 40s and 50s. His work there caught the attention of the DoD, and he applied these techniques to the Mercury space program. And what's really interesting about this is that this was a very, very iterative, very small cycle approach. They were doing, for the Mercury space program, the developers would have a half day to develop. They would actually write their unit test. They would write tests first. They would write their code in a half day. By that half day checkpoint, they had to commit their code and finalize it and push it to main, whatever version control was in the 50s. I'm not sure how that worked.
I think it was still master.
Yeah. So very interesting to hear that there was sort of this small batch iterative cycle mentality at the initial outset of programming. It wasn't until the 1970s when a guy named Winston Royce published a paper called Managing the Development of Large Software Systems. By that time, software had been around, but there was still, Taylorism was heavily embedded into the corporate world, and people wanted, structure, predictable methodology, the ability to predict how the cost and timing of software systems. And so people naturally gravitated towards this Taylorism methodology because it provided that. So this guy, Winston Royce, he writes this paper, and even in the paper, it's kind of tragic. Like in the paper, he talks a lot about small iterative cycles and things that, lead to better software. But the only thing that people could focus on were the big breakdown of the process, which was, you've got this essentially created waterfall, right? You have your requirements, your analysis, and your implementation. So it just put everything in these beautiful 3 buckets. There's actually a nice little chart that looks like water flowing down rocks, and that's how the name waterfall came, which I thought waterfall just meant like you deliver everything at the end. That's why it's called a waterfall. But actually there's these steps. You do system requirements, software requirements, analysis, program design, coding, testing, and operations, and it's all like this little step down. So for whatever reason, I think just because of the impact of Taylorism, software development just gravitated towards this waterfall approach. And they said, oh, finally we have structure. All we have to do is, document all these things, and then writing the code will be simple. So I think it made a lot of sense on paper. And, with the rollout of waterfall, you started having this proliferation of software design notations. That's where like the data flow diagrams came, and class diagrams and sequence diagrams, which they were useful in their own right. But the problem was that developers started to believe that the well-drafted documents would automatically translate into effective code, which was very far from reality. What's crazy is like they did this for like 30 years, right? I mean, they did this waterfall approach. It wasn't until like the late 80s when there was a study conducted by the DoD by a gentleman named Stanley J. Jarzembek. They looked at $37 billion worth of Department of Defense software projects using waterfall. Of those findings, 46% of the projects were never even used, while only 34% saw use after initial release. Most of the features developed were seldom or never used. So it was like a pie chart. It's like 29% the software was paid for but not delivered, 20% software used but needed extensive rework, and then 46%, basically software was delivered but never successfully used. So I mean, it's pretty.
Those are rough numbers.
Yeah, yeah.
Those are higher than I would have thought, actually. Planning that much is alluring because you think you've got everything planned, so you should be able to execute. And then also you think you cover all your bases because, like, especially with government contracts, you have all of these regulations you have to comply with. Basic compliance. Compliance is a big reason that people think planning, ahead of time is a big deal.
Yeah, and if software projects would fail, and they would say, well, we must have not done a good job documenting the requirements. So they just kept like adding more bloat to
doubling
down on we need the documentation. There's something must be wrong with the way we plan this out.
Right.
And it when I was doing the research for the show, it was just like, man, how different would software development be if they had kind of gravitated towards the Walter Shewart method about the plan, do, check, act, which was more iterative in nature and, small batches. Like, how much different would software development be if we hadn't kind of almost lost those 30 years of the waterfall void? Really interesting to think about.
Maybe ChatGPT would have been released 10 years earlier.
Yeah, who knows? So even though there was all this evidence that waterfall was like not working, there were still just people just wanted to cling to their process. It wasn't until around the mid 90s when that cracks in the waterfall armor began to really shine through.
Well, I'm curious, were there any in that period of time, were there major successes where, there must have been some, hey, this worked, so we should keep using it.
I'm sure there was. I don't have any on the top of my hand. Like every software project didn't fail, right?
Right.
And obviously a lot of companies were built around software that are still in business today during that time period. So they obviously made it work.
Maybe the 1 in 5 projects were doing something we don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It would be interesting to see, everyone's doing waterfall wrong.
But that's a good. I like your thought there, Lance. Like, look at what was successful. Like, because it'd be interesting to see. You've heard of, when they would analyze the B-2 bombers when they would come back from their runs in World War II, they'd look at where all the bullets were and be like, oh, we need more shielding in the spots where the bullets aren't because those are the planes that are probably falling, right?
Right.
So, yeah. In the early 90s, you got that's when some of my heroes kind of became players in the space. You've got, James Kaplan and Robert Martin and Robert Fowler. These guys were pretty much just like others' work. There was a lot of respect in the community for what the thoughts that were coming out. You've got the Gang of Four was releasing the design patterns. There was some conferences where these guys would get together and, share thoughts and ideas and start to realize that there had to be a better way to do these things. And there was a particular paper that stood out by James Kaplan that introduced a lot of these concepts that are part of Agile now, like developer controls process, architects also implements, code ownership, application design is bounded by test design. So these ideas were pretty new at the time, but they ultimately became some foundational elements of Agile. Around that time is when guys like Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland submitted their paper called Scrum Development Process. There was guys like Jeff DeLuca who started developing feature-driven development. Alistair Cockburn worked on the Crystal family of methodologies, and other folks were working on systems like dynamic systems development method, rapid application development, which is the work of James Martin. All these things were happening in the 90s, and like it just seemed like there was the winds of change were right there. One of the areas that my personal hero, Robert Martin, gravitated towards was something called extreme programming, which we've heard of. That kind of came out of the 90s as well. So how the Agile Manifesto came to be, as we kind of transition into this part of the talk here, is that Kent Beck and Robert Martin wanted to get together and put together an extreme programming leadership meeting. So they put the word out to all those guys I had just mentioned, and there wasn't a lot of excitement for it outside of Martin Fowler. And so Robert Martin and Martin Fowler got together a few weeks later in Chicago, and they talked about, how are we going to do this? They reached out to Alistair Cockburn, they reached out to him to discuss developing a lightweight process summit. It just so happened that Alistair had already been researching venues for like a developer summit, and suggested that they use the Snowbird Lodge. And then this meeting was set for February 2001. And to their surprise, all of these major players in the software development space said, "Yeah, I'll be there." And so there were 17 in total. 17 guys attended this get together at the Snowbird Lodge, and it consisted of all those individuals from all these different emerging disciplines of software development. And for 2 days, they sat and whiteboarded on the Agile Manifesto. There's a lot of debate about who said what and whose idea was who, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of friction around it. They know there was 17 people there. A lot of things were said. Who gets credit doesn't really matter. But what came out of that was the Agile Manifesto. Ward Cunningham is credited for suggesting that they put the Agile Manifesto online for people to sign and review. So if you haven't seen it, which I hadn't actually looked at it until I'd researched the show, it's just agilemanifesto.org, and you can see the Agile Manifesto, and it very much looks like a website that was built in the 90s. It's beautifully simple. The manifesto itself is beautifully simple. The 12 principles of Agile are beautifully simple. And I had never read it. Like I had never taken the time to read the site, or really I thought it would be this 150 page document or something, but it's really, it's just 4 lines.
The website's beautiful too.
Yeah. Do you want to read the Agile Manifesto to us, Lance?
The 12 principles?
The main page, individuals are in interactions, or the 4.
Yes. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. And so the webpage actually has the stuff on the left, the first sort of 3 to 2 words that I said, in a bigger font to emphasize that.
Yeah, and I think that's that final touch of saying, hey, we value this stuff on the right, but we value the stuff on the left even more. I think that really resonated with the people who first saw this manifesto, and I think it's just a nice touch there, because you could, if it didn't have that, it would be unclear if that other stuff is even important, right? So I think that final nuance is an important piece of it. So that was the Snowbird Summit, and that was a pivotal moment that shaped the future of software development. I can't think of another document or software paradigm that has had so much impact on software industry. Maybe AI might have that impact if we reflect on it 10 or 15 years from now, but it just seems like it was a pivotal moment, and I think the guys that were there kind of knew they were onto something really important.
I think it's not just applies to software, right? I mean, it applies to just building products in general a lot of the time. I mean, obviously there's a lot of very specific things here to software, but if you're building cars, for example, like it still applies even if there's no software.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think like the issue comes when like we talk about serverless or DevOps, right? That the word gets used for marketing purposes, right? And it gets different definitions here and there. It depends on who you're talking to. And I'm sure you could ask, I don't know, 10 people, right? And they would say, "Oh, this is agile," right? But not really hitting on any of these kind of four values. So yeah, that's interesting. You ask, "Oh, we're doing agile. What does that mean to you?" "Oh, well, we're using this tool that our vendor gave us that makes us agile," right? Or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah. That's something we should definitely like touch on. Like the people modify it. There's adaptions. There's interpretations.
Right?
Programmers, managers, corporations.
Is Scrum actually agile if it's a process?
Right. I don't know. I think when I reflect on my career, right, I started my first real job around 2005, 2006, working for a software company. And even by, at that time, the software company was not even aware of Agile or doing Agile. And it wasn't until, I don't know, you were there, Tom. When did we start doing Agile? Or, we started doing Scrum, which I guess is that Agile. But it was probably like 2010-ish, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So, 10 years, it took 9 years for a company in Michigan to catch word of Agile. I'm not sure how, but it seems like at the time, we were doing waterfall. We were doing like the releases once every 12 to 18 months. Revenue was good. The company was successful. We didn't know there was a better way, or maybe we did, or we just weren't able to communicate to the owners of the company that we needed to change our ways. So I think a lot of it had to do with we were transitioning to be a more web focused company versus a desktop solution. And we brought in some consultants who helped us. We brought them in and they were like, "What do you mean you guys aren't doing Agile, Scrum? Like, are you guys?"
It always helps with the catalyst, right? I feel like you're always trying, right, here and there, but in order to get everybody on board, right, it might be one team or whatever, but to get everybody on board, you got to kind of bring in the third party or something big has to change to shake it up, right? The executives, right, they don't like to, if it's working, right, don't fix it if it isn't broken.
I'm assuming that your repercussions weren't that big of a deal because like you were releasing version 1 and version 2 and people were paying for that version. So,
Yeah, but once we realized we could, you can SaaSify a desktop product, right? You don't need to wait 12 to 18 months to release. You can just get them on the subscription and start trickling out features, smaller batches, less risk, all that good stuff. Applies even to desktop software. So curious to know your experience with Agile. Lance, did you know about it right away, or did you start using it as soon as when the manifesto dropped? Did you know right away, or did it take some time for that information to find its way into your web browser?
I have, since my early career, been in startups. So I knew about Agile really early on. And I would attend a lot of conferences in software, and, you'd see people like from ThoughtWorks and stuff like that. So thought leaders in Agile. So I did have a very early understanding of Agile, which was actually not my very, very early understanding of Agile was actually not a good one, because the way that I had implemented it at startups that I was at and had started, so some of the things that I did were, I think, detrimental to the progress of the team, and I definitely noticed some problems with the way that I implemented it. But then I learned, and I have a better understanding of kind of I think with anything, like when you're learning how to program a new programming language, you need to write it. You have to write code. And that's the same thing with this software development process, is that you have to implement it, you have to use it, you have to live it, breathe it, and then figure out, okay, in certain situations this makes sense, and in other situations this makes sense.
Yeah, it's kind of hard when you're working on something you don't know the why, right? The context behind it. And it's like, oh, why do I have this constraint, right? It's hurting me, and it's not until you experience the hurt of not doing that, right, to you learning it. So yeah, it's learning the hard way.
For example, weekly iterations was one thing that I did in my early startup days, and I actually don't think that was great. We moved to 2-week iteration cycle. It was just too fast, and at least for the team that I was dealing with, it just didn't, there was no time to debug and test and whatnot, and it didn't give any breathing room. And then obviously part of that is that the scope of the work that we were asking to get accomplished, we were sort of estimating and like this should get done in 2 weeks, right? But then we never would leave time for debugging and everything else. So.
Mm-hmm. And now you're on a 6-week cycle using ShapeUp, which is kind of call it a grandchild of Agile or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you look at, again, kind of reflecting on my career and knowing that, since 2010, the companies I was working for were doing some type of Agile Scrum process, but yet the dates for delivering things on time was almost always not accurate, right? Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. So I just think like there's still problems with Agile. I don't think Agile tries to, if you look at the manifesto, it doesn't indicate that it's going to solve all your problems or, deliver software on time every time. There's no guarantees with the Agile Manifesto, which I like. I do think that companies and stakeholders still get hung up on the dates of when it wants to get done. And they force engineers to reverse engineer when something's going to get done, even though there's so many unknowns to deliver quality software that I just don't know if the industry will ever get away from that. And it kind of frustrates me. Like I know enough about software development now where it's like I wouldn't put a date on when something needs to be delivered. I'd say let's keep iterating on it until our market tells us it's good enough, or our revenue indicates that whatever we've delivered is resonating with the market. I know that just doesn't fly in corporate world, but I feel like we're not able to, as engineers, as practitioners, we're just not able to communicate that in an effective way to the decision makers of the universe.
There are very real repercussions for not being able to manage a customer's expectations around that, because if a customer thinks that they can get software delivered by a certain time and you haven't told them that that's just not the reality of software, they can sue you, for not delivering on that. They can make you sign a document saying you are going to deliver this for this much at this time, and then they can ask, and then a lot of times they'll ask for more features and scope. They'll be like, the thing you delivered me wasn't what I wanted, and then you're just scrambling to make that happen, and then by the end of the period, then you don't deliver what they were expecting, what they in their mind were expecting, because you didn't have enough time, or you didn't spend enough time trying to learn what exactly it was that they wanted prior to that, maybe with prototypes and faster iteration cycles.
Yeah.
At the end of it, trying to deliver on that, and then you're just putting a lot of risk on yourself with allowing them to put dates on you.
The biggest monumental example of that is healthcare.gov, which I've mentioned on a previous show, where Congress and the president actually signed into law the date in which a piece of software would be delivered. And it's just like, of course, we all know how the launch of healthcare.gov went, and some of the challenges they had. And it's just crazy to think that, you can just pick a date and wave a magic wand and make that happen without actually iterating on and building the software in the most efficient possible way. So that's all I got for this episode, guys. You got anything else you want to share? Any kind of experiences with your Agile experience?
I would say, everyone to read this and take it in, right? And and leverage it. So, when you're in that situation and it comes down to whether it's internal or external customers, right? And it seems like it's that contract negotiation, we're agile, right? We don't do that contract negotiation, right? It's more of that customer collaboration and iterating. And so, yeah, throw it back whenever, a lot of companies, all the companies say they're agile, right? It's like, okay, well then we're not doing that. We're not doing contract negotiation dance, right? This is, or find different customers. The other thing too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Tom. I think I should probably share the 12 principles of the manifesto. Perhaps you'd like to read them, Lance? So if you got the site up, I can pull it up if you don't have it up.
Sure.
But again, they're simple, small, digestible. If you're in the technology space, you should know these, and they should resonate with you. So go ahead, Lance.
Especially your managers and your customers, and your project managers. Principles behind the Agile Manifesto. We follow these principles. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. Deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter timescale. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. Build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done. The most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. Working software is the primary measure of progress. Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behaviors accordingly.
There they are, the 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto.
And I would like to say that I don't think that everything on here should be considered, you should take the pieces that work for you and your situation and your team, and you shouldn't just blindly consider this dogma and that you must do all the things the way that it's sort of prescribed here. You should adapt, just like the word agile. You should adapt it to your team and what makes sense, because obviously there's a lot of stuff in here, a lot of debate around, can remote teams work? And, face-to-face, conversation is the number one thing. And it's like, well, there are ways to do this without having face-to-face conversations these days. And this was also written before we did have really good meeting software you could do online, and it was before COVID. So this might even need some adaptation.
That one stuck out, and the one like releasing monthly or whatever, like it's like you should be releasing like daily if you can, at least every hour if you can. Clayton, welcome to the show. You got a question for us?
Yeah, I guess I should give a disclaimer that I don't consider myself a proper developer, programmer. But, I took some classes at WCC, and one of those was the team programming class where we talked about the software development cycle and, some of the history of it and then Agile. I just got the sense that there's a sort of an intensity and fervor with Agile or implementing Agile. Maybe I'm wrong about that, with scrums and sprints. And I've never worked in like a software shop, I guess. So I guess I don't know that firsthand, but I just got that sense that there was that. But then when I read the manifesto, and we looked at that in our class too, and just the sort of core principles, it's very calm and cogent and just makes a lot of sense and doesn't seem to align with what I picture as this sort of intense kind of process, getting everyone together, sprinting. I mean, I just wonder if there's some kind of perversion of the principles, or what it actually means, what it actually says in the manifesto. You know what I mean? In reality, in this sort of the boots on the ground sort of side of things. Does that make sense?
I'd argue there's a lot of, the tech world is VC backed, a lot of it, right? And so there's this pressure to be first to the market. And so because of that pressure, you're going to have these incentives where you're just like, we need to turn our developers into coal miners.
So that doesn't come with Agile necessarily. That just comes with that's the environment. That's the
company culture. You have to, and you know it right away. If the company culture, if you're always in crunch time, right? It's really common in the game development industry. Crunch time, we got to get the game shipped. Happens in small software companies is just as likely as well. And you just got to be wary of it. It's hard to change an entire company culture on your own, but that is, part of what Agile is about. So, yeah, I would just say try to find a shop that has a good culture and really embraces the principles of Agile and doesn't embrace, crunch culture and breaking your back and, all that stuff, because that's definitely not what Agile is all about. I do think some of the verbiage in Scrum doesn't help, right? When everything's a sprint and you get your sprints over, you retro and okay, let's start another sprint. Like I think just some of the wording around Scrum doesn't help, but the reality is it's all about how your company culture and if they've got a good policy around work-life balance. And I've always been of the opinion where if you're an athlete and you overwork yourself, you're not going to perform well, right? So athletes are going to perform best when they're well-fed, well-rested, and that's been my mantra with the teams that I've managed. So as upper management, I always want to hear that.
Yeah, right. Do we always have to be sprinting? I mean, we can be, if we're trying to learn something, sure, right? Product development is so difficult. Like trying to find product market fit. And when you don't have that and you don't have, your money is short, budget is only finite, okay, let's sprint and try and figure this out. Let's try and figure out how do we get a user to like or use the thing that we're using. Of course, that feels like a moment where you got to get everyone sprinting. But then once you've figured out something, the maintenance of that thing, I don't think you necessarily have to be sprinting all the time. There are learning moments where it could make sense to do these faster iteration cycles, but then other times where you can okay, we're just trying to develop a feature,
That's why I like Shape Up. Check out Shape Up methodology, Clayton. It actually has a built-in decompression period. Is it called the break or what's it called, Lance? The
cool down.
The cool down has, you do 6-week cycles with a 2-week cool down period where you kind of catch your breath, fix the bugs, deal with tech debt, whatever it might be. But I think I like the direction Shape Up's going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks. That's helpful. Thanks.
All right, everybody. That's going to conclude our show for today. So I want to thank my guests, Tom and Lance, for joining me today. I hope everyone found the conversation informative and valuable. Love to have you join us again next week, where we're going to be talking about, we're going to be getting back to Ray Welker, talking about the human side of infrastructure as code, training, onboarding, and culture. So hope you guys can tune in. Thanks for joining. Great to have someone hop on stage and talk with us for once, Clayton. That's exciting. Wish everyone a great week and talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.